Removal, and then I wanted to talk about default too, but go ahead.
Well, don't they kind of go together?
Yes, they do,
Hand in hand.
very much so. No, I'm not holding.
Well, let's talk about mechanical, electrical, and structural inspection removal. Or let's
Well,
just talk about.
All right,
All right, so go ahead. You start.
well, what I want to talk about is there are two contingency removal. I don't care what it is, mortgage financing contingency, due diligence or inspections, survey, anything at all. There are two types of purchase agreements that are written, and the buyer and the seller need to be cognizant of those two disparate ways that they're written. One way is a contingency removal provision that says, unless the buyer removes this contingency in writing, delivered to seller or seller's agents on or before, and then you put a date certain. That's one way to write it, so that now if the purchaser is not satisfied, or is satisfied but fails to remove that contingency in writing, the deal automatically terminates. That's the way it's written, so that.
So can I read one to you? Just as an example of what you're talking about, I think?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, this purchase agreement is contingent upon an inspection by inspector of buyer's choice at buyer's expense to a certain current condition of the property within.
To ascertain the condition.
Within 10 calendar days of acceptance of this offer. This contingency shall be deemed waived unless the buyer, based on the results of the inspection, objects in writing within the time frame permitted for the inspection. Note, the intention of the inspection is not to create a list of repairs for the seller to correct. It is the seller's position that the negotiated price fairly reflects the present as-is condition of the property.
That's the other kind of contingency removal provision. The one I talked about, the one I mentioned, is one in which the buyer has an affirmative duty to notify the seller that the buyer is satisfied with whatever the contingency happens to be, in this case, the condition of the property. What you just read is what's known as a self-executing provision, in which if the buyer fails to notify the seller that the buyer is not satisfied, then the agreement continues. You understand the difference? In the first one, the deal automatically terminates if the buyer doesn't send the notice. In the one you just read, the deal continues and the buyer is deemed to have waived his right to the inspection or to be satisfied with the inspection, unless he sends a notice to the seller saying, I'm not satisfied, I am objecting to the condition. In which case, this provision, it's sort of mealy-mouthed, the second sentence that you read, but at any rate.
Which is the, what do you mean?
Where it
Which
says-
is the mealy-mouthed part?
Where it's as is, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh.
It's really unnecessary because you already have an as-is provision and it's not, you're adding language that is superfluous, you don't need it. And the parties can continue to negotiate if they choose to do so, or they can simply walk from the deal if the buyer sends the notice. And that's the critical aspect of it is buyers and buyers' agents sometimes don't read the purchase agreement carefully enough so that the 10 days is up or whatever the period is, and they fail to send the objection, now they're in, even though they're dissatisfied with the state of the property, the condition of the property. So if they don't have their inspection back, they're still waiting for it, they need to get an extension of the contingency removal period.
Well, if you sign this one,
If you sign this one, it's self-executing.
you said
You're
the property's fine.
No,
That's the way it
no,
is.
no, that's not what that provision says. That provision says it is contingent upon an inspection of the property. They have so many days in which to do it. If they're dissatisfied, the second sentence goes on to say, even if they're dissatisfied, they're still purchasing, if they move forward with the deal, then they're purchasing it, quote, as is. That's all that's saying. The first part, though, is saying you got X number of days in which to satisfy yourself as to the condition of the property. And if you're not satisfied, but you fail to tell us that you're not satisfied, baby, you're in. The deal continues.
Most of our contingencies in our board form for the purchase agreement don't have removal dates, such as the contingency on financing. It states that it's going to be contingent on, let's say, a conventional type mortgage for no less than 30 years for X% interest rate and with X% down, and that they qualify for that. So if they don't qualify, then
You
they
could
can
get right
get
up
out
to
of
the
it.
date of closing, and that's
Right.
why that particular provision, in my opinion, is poorly written. You would always have a date and even a time. I say it's gotta be removed in writing, signed by the purchaser, delivered to the seller or the seller's agents on or before 5 PM on whatever the date is. Because I don't wanna get into an argument, some say on thus and such a date. Well, I don't want them delivering it at 10 o'clock that night. I wanna know by the close of business on that day whether or not I've got a deal or not.
Right, and ours doesn't,
Yours doesn't even have a contingency
if
removal,
someone could
so,
lose their job the day of closing and the deal goes down the drain.
right, you wanna have a date certain sometime before the closing, so the seller, think of the poor seller, you've
Right.
got a contingency removal, which goes all the way up to date of closing. The date of closing arrives, the seller's already moved all their stuff out of the property,
Mm-hmm.
and yet the deal can still fall. That's a poorly drafted purchase agreement.
But I'm looking at all of these contingencies on a standard Jackson Area Association Realtors purchase agreement, and I don't think there's a single one. There's well and septic and water contingency. It just says to furnish a written report stating that the septic tank is in good working order. Doesn't say by when.
And that's why I hate the word standard, because in my opinion, there is no quote standard purchase agreement, and you have to remember that a purchase agreement can be written in a neutral fashion, it can be written in a fashion which favors the seller, or it can be drafted in a fashion which favors the purchaser. The one you're looking at is drafted in the favor of the purchaser, because the purchaser literally has up until the date of closing in which to move forward with the deal or not, and that puts the seller at a very distinct disadvantage.
Why
Right.
wouldn't there be a date on that?
Because it's the quote standard end quote form drafted
just
by
doesn't-
the Association of
It
Realtors.
seems silly, doesn't it?
That's a kind way to put it.
Thank you.
Okay?
Greg is a kind man.
Well-
Look at him.
I just don't,
Yeah, that's a.
I'm not a lawyer.
But
No,
that's,
it
but
does
that's a
say-
euphemistic way to say it. I would say it's poorly drafted because
Okay.
you always want, and I think the purchaser wants that too. The purchaser wants to
Sure.
have a date certain before the closing, so we know at least 10 days before the closing, we have a deal or we don't.
Mm-hmm.
We now can take those steps necessary before the closing itself to make sure everything is in order.
Now, it does say, note, if any of the above reports regarding well and septic are found deficient, the seller and buyer agree to negotiate in good faith the cost of the correction.
That's, again, that's the mealy mouth portion
Right, it
because.
says note, colon.
Yeah,
You
but
know.
all that's doing is saying to the parties, well, okay, if you want to negotiate, you can do it, but everybody ought to know
Of
that you
course
can
you
do
can.
that right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I wouldn't even include that in the agreement. But again, there are all kinds of quote standard end quote forms. The most important lesson you learn, I guess, as a party to this, or as a broker or agent representing a party, is if you don't have a lawyer representing you who's looking at the agreement, you sure better read the thing to make certain that you understand every word, every sentence, every phrase in that agreement. And I always do a timetable saying this is the date, this has to be done, this is the date, this has to be done, this is the date, so that everybody's on the same page. Dead silence on the other end.
Because that can get complex.
Yeah, it can get very complex, and those dates can shift, and you always want to make certain as a party to the deal, if you can't meet one of those dates, you have to get a written extension signed by the parties agreeing that this date is going to be extended out a period of time to allow the purchaser to do the inspection. Maybe something's found in the inspection and they need to do something in addition. Now they have to get a structural engineer in, or pest inspector, somebody else to follow up on the initial inspection, so you need more time. Get a written extension of the agreement. You might have to extend the contingency removal date, and you might have to extend the closing date, both.
Bill, do you see sellers juggling multiple offers in this regard?
The answer is occasionally. Usually what happens is you'll have a backup offer, so everything sort of stops on the backup offer unless and until the first offer falls. In other words, if I have multiple offers and I get one agreement in place, as a seller, I can't have another agreement in place that isn't contingent on the first one falling through. That's the first order of business. In other words,
Otherwise, you've sold the house twice.
otherwise I've sold it twice and then I have to move to Costa Rica with all the money. and I can't live for very long on that, those proceeds. So at any rate, so it's backup, and the purchaser on the backup deal isn't going to be willing to spend money doing inspections, et cetera, unless and until they know that the first deal has fallen through and the second deal now moves into first position. So, but yeah, you get some multiple offers. I haven't really, most of my stuff is commercial, industrial, shopping centers, things like that, larger deals, and we just don't see multiple offers on those things.
We're seeing multiple offers. I mean, I just negotiated one, was dealing with it, waiting for response over the weekend, and ours was cash and the competing offer was conventional.
You're with the seller?
I'm the buyer.
You're the buyer.
I'm working with the buyer.
But-
And the buyer that I have is cash, and the competing offer was conventional.
Conventional mortgage, have to go out and get a mortgage.
Right.
So
So
cash,
cash wins?
Cash,
cash is king.
cash is always king.
Yeah.
And even if the bottom line, I think in this case, the bottom line worked out the same or better for the cash, but even if the cash transaction brings the seller a little bit less, I would always take a cash transaction over a mortgage. Depends on how much less, I guess.
Yeah, and then also I want to make certain that the cash offer has cash to
Cash,
back it up.
right.
In other words, that this particular purchaser has the economic wherewithal to be able to meet the cash.
But the downfall
needs
of
at the
the
closing.
market cleaned up our market in that regard, because foreclosures, the banks that own the foreclosures insisted on pre-approval letters, proof of funds, and the funds had to show your name on the account. I couldn't use my mother's account to prove I had the funds. I had to have the funds in my own name.
Now, have you represented somebody with a cash offer and they haven't had the cash?
No.
Okay.
I don't think so. Have we?
And
We've
I
been
have
on the
rather
receiving
over the
end
years.
of it,
Really?
but-
Yeah,
That surprises me.
Well,
Oh, on the-
but we always make certain. I've even done deals in which, and I'll say these are smaller deals, smaller commercial deals, or it could be larger residential deals, in which we actually make the earnest money deposit, the entire purchase price, because they want the property so badly. They simply say at the front end, we're going to put $350,000
Well, we just had that.
into an escrow account, and it's sitting there, so we know the cash is there. So yeah, when a purchaser comes in and makes a cash offer, I, as the attorney for the purchaser, am going to make certain, because I don't want my client to end up in default. If I'm representing the seller, we'll get the necessary economics,
Show me the
balance
money.
sheets. Exactly.
And we don't really even start negotiating until that letter's in hand, or the proof of funds are in hand, because it's a waste of time otherwise.
Yeah, I did a deal on which I represented a purchaser. This is it was a very complicated foreclosure on a house in Grosse Pointe that was a multi-million-dollar house. We ended up buying it for, I think, $850,000 through the foreclosure. But in dealing with the bank, part of the deal was, in order to sell this outside of a foreclosure sale and auction, was that we had to post the entire price. The entire amount was put into the bank's lawyer's trust account in anticipation as to consummate the settlement.
Now, I'd put it in a title company. I wouldn't put it with anybody other than a title.
No, I have no, this is a large law firm in Detroit, very reputable, and lawyers' trust accounts are subject to all of these restrictions imposed by the state bar.
Are they in Costa Rica? No.
No. It's fun being a lawyer, though, because I should tell you that I have clients who, I mentioned these oil and gas cases, and this is a completely unrelated thing, but the preliminary exam on this, the criminal aspect brought by the state attorney general, was held up in Sheboygan all week last week, and it's going all this week. This week there were 28 victims, of whom I represent a bunch of them.
Why was
in
it
civil
held in
cases.
Sheboygan?
Because that's where the leases were, these oil and gas
Oh.
leases that were breached.
They were
some of
in
them
that
Sheboygan.
county, or
In Sheboygan County,
Okay.
right. And so the AG, but there are several in other counties as well, Kalkaska, Emmett, et cetera. But at any rate,
I used to live there.
where?
Sheboygan.
I thought
You don't
were
really live in
Costa
Sheboygan, you
Rica.
only exist.
No.
You only exist. No, Sheboygan's a great place. But at any rate, let me just tell you that
Harbor Town.
Yes, I got reports from my clients that this case is so important. There were 8 lawyers representing the defendant. in
Really?
this
How,
case.
how can you have 8 lawyers? That's stupid.
They had 8 lawyers.
8 lawyers have never been in Sheboygan County, ever.
Oh, no, there's usually a lot of lawyers everywhere.
So
I-
anyway, when you were just talking about cash and how cash is king, I'm just sitting there and I'm thinking, and the lead
So how much did
lawyers
that
from
cost?
Wilmer Hale, which is a Washington D.C. very large, prestigious international firm.
Per
So,
hour.
you've got
Oh, wait,
lawyers who are
let's add
sitting
it
there,
up.
8 lawyers. I'm sure the lead lawyer is charging $1,500 an hour.
Seriously?
Yeah.
How come you don't charge that?
Yeah,
Gee.
I'm thinking about it. I'm seriously thinking
Wow.
about it.
$1,500 an hour, and then the secondary
Uh,
lawyer?
Where'd they
Everybody
stay
else.
at Fred's Lodge?
I don't know where they stayed in Sheboygan, but they were
Yeah.
out there all week last
Well,
week.
at
They were there.
$1,500 an hour, they can take that ferry right across and go stay at the Grand or the Iroquois.
The Mackinac Island.
Or they, yeah, they could.
You know, they
But,
could fly back and forth.
Yeah, it was,
right?
I'm
They could buy
actually,
St. Ignace.
I'm actually headed up north to meet with a bunch of these clients tomorrow or Wednesday,
Oh.
and I'll get the full report on it. But they said that every question that was asked by the lead attorney, the 7 lawyers who were sitting at the council table, they were scribbling furiously.
Well,
They-
and
Bring
how
their,
do you-
bring their names back.
and
They're
how do
probably
you-
all related.
And how do you determine which lawyer's
Oh,
going to
no, no,
talk?
these lawyers
I
aren't
can't even
from
get a word in
Sheboygan. No, I-
edgewise with
yeah.
you.
These lawyers are mostly from Washington. I don't
Yeah.
know who the other ones were, but yeah, this is a huge, huge criminal antitrust case, and then we've got the civil end of it, and we've got, I think,
And how many lawyers are on your side?
30 some. We have myself, my associate, and our counsel up north.
So 3. 3
Yeah.
to 8. Ooh. How's your batting average going?
We'll see. I'll give you the report.
You've been
probably.
winning, haven't you?
Yeah, I hope so. I hope
That's
I
the
am.
plan.
Yeah,
Well,
right.
I know.
Right.
But I just have to make sure.
Are you selling any houses?
I'm trying to. We had an
Oh.
open house over the weekend
How'd that go?
yesterday. It would have gone better if we didn't have a snafu with our signs, but hey, stuff happens, right?
Yeah, it does.
We've got a couple. We're going to start hot and heavy on open houses again right after Labor Day.
Okay.
I've got some new listings coming up this week. Can't give out the details yet.
Okay.
Like sign them on
Website?
the dotted line. Laura. How about thinkingrealestate.com? 780-3800. Call me.
You look very nice today, by the way.
Thank you.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
2 weeks. Yeah.
Assistant